Psychiatric ward nurses, what did a patient do that left them speechless during my mental health rotation? In nursing school, it was a juvenile facility. I met a boy for whom I had to do the intake, inventory his belongings, and take him to his room. He was in the intake room waiting with no clothes on, drawing circles all over the room with human waste. Once we took that boy to his floor, they introduced me to a teenager who had a psychotic break of some kind and was just saying different intonations of turn down for a war in response to everything. They said he'd been like that for about 3 weeks. I sat down to lunch with a girl who seemed super normal until the nurses told me later that she had driven her sister crazy by repeatedly stabbing him with a knife when he was 10 and his sister was 4 during a 12-hour shift. It was enough to show me that I never, ever want to be psychiatric nurse. There are some people who don't have true psychiatric disorders but end up in the facility. There was a sweet older man who had a slurred speech, and they thought he'd had a stroke. They ran some tests, and it turned out he had ALS, a disease of the nervous system that weakens muscles and affects physical functions. It was the kind that starts in the throat. They gave him the news, and he cried for 2 days straight. I played old country songs on my phone even though you're supposed to leave it in your locker. He was there for a year and a half. We had to watch him slowly deteriorate. First, he lost his speech, then he couldn't swallow. Then his head and neck became locked in a certain position. He had secretions coming out of his mouth, and he used a cloth to soak them up. Then, they had to put a tube in his stomach. He was afraid to go to bed at night because the secretions were choking him. I would sit by his bed and he started gasping for air and gasping for air. I would sit him up and pat him on the back. He also had a DNR order. I was always afraid he would stop breathing. I would check his chest to make sure he was alive. One day on second shift, they said he had lain down. There was a mucus plug and he turned blue. They did suctioning. He went to the local hospital by ambulance and he passed away at the end of the week. I am a direct support professional on a psychiatric ward. Under no circumstances are we allowed to leave the premises without supervision relief for clients. This means that if the next shift didn't arrive when you were supposed to go home, you had to stay, no excuses. This often required me to work 16 to 32-hour shifts. I was supposed to leave at midnight on a red site. Red means patients with a high level of psychotic disorder, and my relief didn't show up for their shift. 12 to 8 a.m. I had been there since 8 in the morning. I had to stay. There was one client in particular who was getting worse with his schizophrenia during the night. They told me that only men worked the night shift at this location because this client became extremely aggressive toward women, and I was small, my 265 centimeters. At 2 in the morning, the client walked into the staff supervision room. It was just a room with a table, a plastic chair, a radio, and a refrigerator. I was doing paperwork. The client started circling my table, desperately scratching his face and muttering, "I need to kill, over and over again as he circled around me. I called my supervisor. I told her what was happening and that I was going to leave because I feared for my life and was extremely tired. She basically told me that if I left, she would fire me. I also wasn't allowed to lock him in his room because the places where I worked were company-owned houses that housed individuals with mental disorders. They wanted to foster a sense of this is your home, so they would have complete freedom about the house and where to go. I put the plastic table in the corner and positioned myself between the corner and the table. I called the police. The police escorted me out, and I refused to return to work. The following days, my boss kept calling me and asking if I could return to work since they were short-staffed, and I told her to forget about me. I have many stories. A sad but fascinating one. This pretty little girl, probably about 7 years old, had arrived around 2 a.m. at our center. She was adorable, super sweet, and a little slow. I immediately became friends with her and kept wondering why Protective Services sends these children, who seem fine to me, to us. She shouldn't be here. Or so I thought. It turns out that afternoon, she came home from school. The front door was unlocked, so she let herself in through the door. The garage door opened and there was her dad. Dad had a chainsaw and was literally using it on someone. I think it was a family member. She still didn't understand what was happening. Or was I in some kind of shock? I couldn't say it, but damn, that one blew my mind, and I'll never forget it. I'm a nurse. The next thing didn't happen. It happened at work one night, leaving the movies with my 11-year-old son. We walked past a disheveled young woman who was obviously distressed. I asked her if she was okay. She said she wasn't and burst into uncontrollable tears. I gave her a hug and told her everything was going to be okay. We stayed like that for a long time. I could tell she was seriously unbalanced and desperate. To summarize, She had been on a psychiatric hold at a small community hospital north of us. She had been released and given a one-way ticket to the city where the movie theater was, and they just left her there. She listed a long list of psychiatric and anti-anxiety medications, along with their dosages, that she had been prescribed but hadn't been taking because she wasn't taking them. I had access to them. She told me her story: lost jobs, lost children, a divorce. It was heartbreaking. I tried to convince her to let me get help, and her reaction was as expected. She said she had been wandering around the mall for 3 days and looked like this. I gave her the $0 I had with me. I took my son to the car, called 911, and explained the situation. I wanted my son to experience the first part, where we show compassion to people in their time of need. I didn't want him to see the ugly part, where they took her into custody. I drove to where I had been hoping to keep an eye on her until she got to medical help, but she was already gone. I begged for help to pick her up because she was vulnerable and a danger to herself. I doubt they would. She was so upset. I doubt I did a good job articulating what needed to be done. It wasn't my finest moment. Damn, still. It moves me, I hope, that they have found her and that she is on the road to recovery in my country. People with mental illness and people with chemical dependency are treated like garbage. I wish it were different. Probably the most tragic story I've heard comes from my mother. She worked in a care home on the Isle of Man in the 1980s, caring for an 80-year-old woman with dementia. Her name was David, and she came to the island from Scotland when she was 16 to marry a man from the island whom she had met while on holiday with her parents. He was handsome, well off, and they were madly in love. Davina quickly became the envy of all the single women on the island, as her new husband was very desirable. After they were married, they bought a beautiful house on the seafront and had a baby girl. A woman on the island did everything she could to separate them and spread a malicious rumor that her husband had been unfaithful. It was a small island in the 1910s, so she was the talk of the town. Heartbroken and delirious, Davina took her newborn baby and walked into the sea. They pulled her out, but her baby was swept away by the waves. She was immediately institutionalized at 17 and spent her entire life in a psychiatric ward until she was moved to a care home when she developed dementia. Her entire life, completely lost. Every day she would ask my mother where her baby was and would often run away and try to walk to the beach less than 1 kilometer away, presumably to see if her child had appeared. My mother gave her a doll, and she cried with happiness, genuinely believing that her baby had been found. She truly believed that the doll was her own flesh and blood. This is not my story, but I have heard many from my mother. She does not work in a ward. Psychiatric, but works with people you would find there. She would go on visits to check on people and see if they needed to be returned to care, etc. Anyway, one that stands out for me was once they received a call about an elderly woman. I think it was the neighbors who called. I don't know the details of the call, but it was decided to go visit this woman. They arrived, rang the doorbell, and after a while, an elderly woman opened the door. She hadn't been taking care of herself at all when it came to personal hygiene. She had long hair, long nails, was dirty, etc. Oh, and she was also only wearing a robe, which was open, allowed them to enter. The apartment looked as one would expect, according to the lady's description: dirty, filthy garbage everywhere, and of course, a very bad smell. They walk further into the apartment to chat with the woman. After a short while, my mother starts to smell something even worse. She looks around and sees something cooking on the stove. She gets closer and look, in the pot, the woman was cooking her own waste with toilet paper and everything else. There was even a ladle. I don't remember anything else. But I guess they took her to care. There was a resident in the intensive care unit at the nursing home where I worked who had Alzheimer's and was severely depressed. On my first day, when I was still in training, he called me asking for help. I approached him to see what I could do to help him. He turned around, looked me in the eyes, and without a hint of joy in his eyes, he told me to please end his miserable life. My eyes opened wide, and I didn't say anything because I was trying to process the whole situation. Fortunately, my trainer noticed what was going on and came to pick me up. Later, I learned that the guy was a clinical psychologist who had spent his life studying Alzheimer's. So when he started noticing me showing symptoms, he became very depressed and died very quickly. Now he lives in the nursing home, horribly depressed all the time, and he doesn't remember why. It was a very dark thing to face on my first day. I only ended up working there for a month. My girlfriend, we'll call Kai, works a second job at a center that provides mental health services. More specifically, she works at a facility that reintegrates people with severe schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, drug addiction, etc. back into society. These people live in an apartment building owned and operated by this organization. Kai's main job is to distribute medication to the residents. One night, he received a call from a resident who told him she needed help. Kai went up to this woman's room. He knocked on the door. They told him to come in. He opened the door and saw her standing in her living room holding a knife to her neck. Both of the residents' wrists were already bruised and stained red. The resident proceeded to stab her neck horizontally. At that moment, he fell. He heard screams coming from the bathroom. He entered the bathroom and found the resident's phone and a call on speakerphone with her mother. KY explained to the resident's mother who she was and that she needed to call 911. There was so much red liquid in the bathroom sink that it had completely saturated a roll of paper towels that had fallen over. Kai grabbed some towels, ran back to the resident, wrapped them around her wrists to try to stop the hemoglobin loss, and then called 911. The ambulance arrived and took her away. Somehow, miraculously, the resident survived that same night. Kai had to check on another resident who hadn't checked in the last 24 hours. Kai went to the woman's room and had to go in herself. Due to the lack of response after knocking and calling the resident's phone, she opened the door and found the woman lifeless in her recliner. Needless to say, Kai was quite traumatized after working that shift. I'm not a nurse, but I was temporarily in a psychiatric ward. I was playing chess with a guy who got up to see the therapist they had there. There was an old man named Gary who I think had dementia because of the things he said. He was never violent, but sometimes I thought he was a master in certain situations. He said some very strange things, and once he wiped the table with his shirt. Once he fell asleep next to me in a chair. Also, one I'll never forget was when I looked through the hallway door. I was in the main recreation room. The hallway led to the rest of the place. Gary had a small disagreement with one of the staff members. Here's the conversation. I noticed you don't have any orange juice, only grape juice. That's right, sorry. Gar, nod slowly. You're fired. Then he walks away. I guess I'm fired now, the nurse said, laughing. I hope he's okay. He had a few situations like that. When I was there, nothing serious, but I couldn't help but laugh at some. Perhaps not surprisingly, but an absolutely fascinating realization I came to while working with a particular patient. A patient with schizophrenia was describing his hallucinations. He mostly experienced visual disturbances such as seeing bubbling and tilting of his visual field, but when his anxiety became heightened, he would hallucinate a large black dog coming into his room or seeing it at the end of the hall. I was a student and was reluctant to ask him if he was familiar, but what his description immediately reminded me of was the dog from ancient European folklore and legend, most recently referenced in Harry Potter. It is described as an ethereal black dog that served as an omen of impending death to anyone who saw it, invisible to everyone else. That made me think, that was this hallucination of a common dog. Assuming it did, what happened to people in the Middle Ages and later centuries who had psychotic episodes? How long did they live? I imagine that a schizophrenic person living in a time and place with no concept of mental health care would easily find themselves in altercations, breaking the law, and making generally bad decisions that can end in accidental death, a fatal encounter with a man or beast, execution, or the end still with psychotic people taking their lives. My guess is that perhaps people in Europe who experienced psychotic episodes would hallucinate the Grim Reaper, tell others who of course couldn't see it, and as their psychosis worsened, they would meet their untimely deaths. This occurred enough that word got around that if you saw this infamous black dog, your time was up. Near the end. A light search for green plus the term schizophrenia yielded no results. I would love to delve deeper into this hypothesis someday. I'm not a nurse, but I was a patient. I was hospitalized after an attempt to kill myself. I'm diabetic, and they switched my insulin to one I'd never used before because they weren't familiar with my treatment. They gave me insulin around 7 p.m. I fell asleep around 9 p.m. but woke up around 11 a.m. because I felt strange, like my glucose was low. I went to the nurse's station and told the nurse that I needed to have my glucose checked. She told me it was time to sleep and that I should go back to bed. After trying to convince her to only take a few minutes to check my glucose, the clumsy woman called security, who escorted me back to my room and locked me in. Then, while I was in the facility was literally under surveillance. They told me when I was asking for life-sustaining treatment that I should go to sleep and possibly stop breathing during sleep, or pass out or fall asleep when I woke up about 2 hours later after coming out of a severe hypoglycemic event. My glucose was at 19 when they checked me and they realized something was wrong. During surveillance, frequent checks are performed every 10 to 15 minutes. Surprisingly, it took them 2 hours to realize something wasn't right. When I was able to get up, I vented to that woman. Security got involved, getting between her and me, but they let me vent. I think the most powerful thing I said to her was, "Just because I'm depressed doesn't mean I'm crazy or an idiot. I could have died because you didn't bother to take 2 minutes to prick my damn finger." If her tears the next morning and her absence for the remainder of my stay is any indication that she was fired that same morning. This isn't my story, it's my father's, but it's too good not to share. When my dad started as a psychiatric nurse, he generally got the unpleasant jobs that no one else wanted to do. There used to be an older man on the ward where he worked. Apparently, he used to be a school principal. So he was incredibly rigid, quiet, and by all accounts, a jerk with little respect for the ward staff. He was also quite verbally abusive most of the time and had a general disdain for anyone he encountered. He used to wear a huge green coat every day, no matter the occasion, and was generally quite scruffy with very poor personal hygiene and quite smelly all the time. As a result, the nurses had to wash his hair and cut his fingernails and toenails whenever he allowed it, being one of the younger nurses in the ward. My dad had to clip this old man's toenails. One day, he said he'd done it once or twice before, and it was a rather nauseating process, made worse by the fact that the old warden didn't owe him a nice word while he was doing it, making it an overall rather dehumanizing experience. On this particular occasion, my dad remembers the patient being unusually quiet and not abusive when he started clipping his toenails, but he didn't think much of it. Apparently, halfway through clipping the nails, considering the nurses usually knelt in front of this guy while they did it, my dad said this old guy started massaging his head. My dad is a super calm, lovely, and sweet person who usually only anticipates the best in people, so he apparently thought this guy was simply showing an unusual moment of affection. That was until the smell came. Horrible smell. It turns out the old man had been storing his own human waste in the very deep pockets of his coat for what my dad estimated was the last week or so. And now he proceeded to massage it into my dad's scalp, vigorously. It took my dad a few seconds to realize, but when he did, he had to rush out of the room to expel his last meal, which he ate, into the nearest sink. He then proceeded to wash his hair with hospital-grade hand sanitizer, since it was the only thing he had on hand. Apparently, the smell stayed in his hair for about a week, and during that time, he had to wear a bandana to avoid feeling dizzy from the smell of his own hair. This is just one of literally hundreds of stories my dad has shared with me during his time as a psychiatric nurse. Most of them are equally bizarre, some are heartbreaking, shocking, and overall disturbing. Most of them have a good degree of humanity. There are stories that make us laugh and that we ask Dad to tell and retell. But at the end of the day, my dad and his colleagues have a great deal of care, compassion, and patience for the people they care for. Sometimes it's good to laugh at the bad things after a difficult day. It was always interesting to hear someone admitting they were in the midst of a schizophrenic crisis. Their first time experiencing hallucinations, their seemingly normal life suddenly becomes confusing, and reality begins to unravel before their eyes. A guy was at work when he started hallucinating that Dr. F came out of the TV at the gas station to say all kinds of satanic things. Another guy shot his TV. His dad called the police, and he barricaded himself in his room and injured himself in the heart. He survived, and we had to take him to his first trial to decide whether he went to a mental hospital or jail. The judge was gathering evidence from all sides and allowed him to speak. I spent 30 minutes by his side in the car on the way there, and I knew it was going to be a very interesting talk about satanic rituals for about 30 minutes, minus the time I tried to talk about our mutual love for my sister, Madam. To calm him down, he stands up, and the judge tells him, "Is it true that all that happened? Stabbing, shooting, madness." He stands up in front of a room full of lawyers, medical staff, a jury, and all these people, grabs the microphone and says, "Judge, God told me to take a huge black self-pleasure toy and stick it up my father's asterisk. I need to do the Lord's work, please." He sits down. The judge raises an eyebrow. I try not to lose my composure, and he just says, "Okay, I think I've heard enough here." The guy didn't say another word. I don't think he even knew where he was going or what had just happened. He walked calmly into the psychiatric hospital without any problems. He worked in a psychiatric hospice ward. In the laundry room, all kinds of crazy, creepy things happened. Disgusting, but one stuck with me and still gives me nightmares. There was an older man nicknamed Hunter. And although he was physically able, he had the mind of a child. He always wore Disney uniforms to work, which made him happy. While I delivered his laundry to his room, I always took extra time to talk to him. He always wanted to show me his board books, his stuffed animals, or his airplane sheets. Sometimes we even played pat-a-cake, rock paper scissors. etc. He was a sweetheart and completely innocent, but one day while I wasn't at work, he fell and hit his head on a door frame. Besides a bump, he seemed to be fine, according to the nurses. But the next time I saw him, I noticed he had destroyed all his stuffed animals. I asked him what happened. He lunged at me, bit me on the arm, and then started thrashing around like he was trying to hit me in a child's fight. Slapping. I don't know what happened. I'm not a doctor, but it was like a switch flipped in his head, and from then on, it was just violence and rage. Eventually, he had to be moved to the other side of the ward, the part enclosed with padded things. I still think about him all the time, but the only time I tried to visit him after resigning, I wasn't allowed to see him due to behavioral issues. I'm not a nurse, but I saw some funny, scary, and wild things during my stay at my friendly neighborhood psychiatric ward. The scariest thing was probably my roommate. I'm not here to judge because I know every patient has their completely valid reasons for ending up in a ward, but the one I was in was the ward for all the diagnosed schizophrenics, detoxing bipolars, anxious people with OCD, depressed sociopaths, people who self-harm. Everyone was there, like someone who transferred from a facility. Of eating disorder treatment pretty calm. This was a completely new level that I wasn't used to seeing, and that made my old place look like a teenage girl's sleepover. I'm basically trying to justify myself as an anxious person because I was afraid of the more aggressive patients. So, my roommate practically ignored my existence for me. I clearly remember when I first saw her, noticing her shaved head and her incredibly stunning golden green eyes. I walked into my room that first night like a tearful idiot, having finally reached my mom on the phone. I tried to force a pathetic smile and mumble a hello. My roommate didn't look up from where she was curled up in her bed. I felt pretty stupid, but I was in some kind of trance. So, nothing really mattered. It was almost lights out time, and I was getting ready for bed. When I passed by our shared cubicles on my way to our bathroom, I noticed she had put away some art projects from what was probably a group activity, curious and nosy about my shy roommate. I stopped. And I looked a little closer. They were crude drawings made with crayons and printer paper, but quite disturbing. I remember seeing what looked like a person with no arms or legs, lots of scribbles, glowing eyes all over the place, and incomprehensible words scattered across the paper. I think Mom mentioned something. I laughed to myself. I thought, I guess I'll die. I went to bed that night. There was a thunderstorm. I remember it jumping every time a nurse came in and checked on us. I didn't sleep. I never got to meet my roommate before I left, and I only heard her speak once, but I felt bad for her. I wonder what had happened in her past that created such dark images in her mind, maybe some kind of abuse. I still think about the people I met there from time to time. I hope they're all in one place. I've been a psychiatric nurse in a confinement unit for over 2 years. The funniest thing that left me speechless was a patient who she threw a cookie at me, then showed off her private parts. Then she did cartwheels down the hallway, showing off her privates. Something memorable was an attractive young woman who was psychotic and unstable. She was screaming in the group room and then went to her room. I was waiting for her to calm down. I heard a technician yelling, "Don't stop." I ran. And I saw that she had drawn with her red menstrual fluid all over the window in the bathroom. While the technician ran to get cleaning supplies, I asked her what she was doing. Her lips turned red and she said lipstick. I yelled at her to stop. While I put on gloves, she started crying. Before I could clean her up, she pulled a packet of lemon juice out of her pocket and poured it in her eyes, saying, "I don't want to be here now. I'm invisible." She cried loudly and like a child while we were changing her and washing her. It left me speechless. A man in his 30 years, 180 tall, and 113 kilos mentally. Maybe 4 years old, actively hallucinating and delusional, had already spent 3 months between 2 other hospitals, couldn't write his first name or verbalize his last name, couldn't answer where he was from or where he lived. He had high blood pressure the day he arrived. He only had the clothes on his back. His shoes had holes the size of a dollar coin in the sole. He was in our facility for 5 months. It's a short stay facility. Normally no family visited him. His family was not successfully contacted during those 8 months. Our staff bought him clothes. Our social worker struggled for months to find a group home that could accept psychotic and intellectual issues. Occasionally he would lash out at other men because of the voices and would look at women saying, "Give me a kiss," before hugging them. In short, the social worker found a group home for him. The staff made sure he had decent clothes and shoes, and we discharged him. The lady who he was going to take him to the social security office with our unit director present to transfer his check to the group home. Immediately his family started calling because they found out about the check transfer. After 8 months, they came and picked him up from the lobby. We had a technician sitting with him until they arrived several hours later and didn't speak to any staff member. I hope he didn't get lost in the streets and die. He would have loved that group home.